I'm here with Willie Jennings, Associate Professor of Theology and Black Church Studies at Duke Divinity School, a very good friend of mine. We are here in New Haven today for a consultation on the theology of joy. Professor Jennings, it's great to have you with us. Willie,
glad to be here.
Wonderful to have a conversation with you about joy.
My pleasure, Dr. Volf. My pleasure, Rick.
So, what is joy for you as a theologian, as a churchman, as a black man?
I look at joy as an act of resistance against despair and its forces, all the forces of despair. And joy in that regard is a work that can become a state, that can become a way of life.
And it resists what?
Despair.
Despair.
Despair in all the ways that despair wants to drive us toward death and wants to make death the final word. And death in this regard is not simply the end of life, but it's death in all its signatures. Death, violence, war, debt, all the ways in which life can be strangled and presented to us as not worth living.
So is this a way of singing Lord's song in the strange land? Is this a way of living a right life in the false one, to use Adorno's phrase? How would you put it?
I like singing a song in a strange land. I also like, as I love to say, making productive use of pain and suffering and the absurd. Not in order to take them lightly, but to take them very seriously, but not to make them gods. So it is pushing back. It is counterintuitive in that regard.
How does one find, though, kind of strengths? How does one forge the weapon of joy in the midst of suffering, oppression? How does one cultivate joy?
Well, practically, you have to have people who you've heard sing those songs in strange lands. You have to have people who have been able to make you laugh in the places where all you want to do is cry. You have to have conditions set up where those people who have learned how to ride the winds of chaos can say to you, come on, let me show you how to do that. I think that's the first thing you have to have. And then the second thing you have to have is a willingness to want to hold on to life, even when there is very little that makes sense in life. And joy is the currency that is flowing between hands in such situations.
You know, I don't know whether I'm maybe romanticizing things, but it seemed to me that from what I have observed growing up, but also when I have traveled, that I find more joy in the midst of oppression in an almost paradoxical way than I find in plenty.
Yeah.
It's almost like joy is this plant that more easily springs in adversity than it does in a kind of plenty and posh kind of life that breeds more indifference.
Yeah, I would say something similar, but I would probably read it in this way. In context where your energies have to be focused on survival, it doesn't leave a lot of energy for overt forms of complaint. There can be complaint, but you're spending a lot of energy just trying to hold it together. And I think at another level, the work of joy becomes serious work, which I think in our context, and by our context I mean in the West, the work of joy in many ways is not fully the people's work.
Whose work is it?
It's brought to us, and it's commercialized. It is a part of the empire of advertisement, that they do the work, the creative work of presenting to you what is joyful and what can become, part of the reality of how you create enjoyment and pleasure. But in contexts where that hasn't fully taken hold, the people's work of creating joy is there. I grew up in such a situation. Learning how to have a good time with nothing, because we had nothing. And there's something very powerful about that, because, as one artist says, it's how especially oppressed and poor people can make something really beautiful out of what has been thrown away. We are not attuned to a world in which we have to work with what's been thrown away, because we are the ones who throw away. But what does it mean when you're someplace where the world's trash comes to you, and out of that trash you have to do something? And it creates a very different way of thinking about joy.
You've spoken or written in your paper for this consultation about kind of segregated joy. Kind of joy that's part of a particular, maybe identity inherited, forged in adversity, and in your particular case, as a legacy of slavery.
There is something absolutely beautiful about the joy created by communities, especially oppressed communities. And the clear example I'm drawing on is African diaspora communities, in which there's a reality of joy built inside the forced segregation, the separation of the races geographically speaking, and not simply socially speaking. And there's something very powerful about a womb of joy that nurtures and helps constitute identity. But there's also another side, not only to just African diaspora forms of joy, but the joy in many communities, and that is segregated joy is fundamentally a part of the reality of segregation, which means that it is a joy that in many instances is built on insult, it's built on hatred of the other. And here I'm not thinking primarily about African American or African diaspora communities, but I'm thinking about the way in which multiple communities, their joy is inside of a hard segregation. And so the question becomes for me, can there be a form of joy that helps to constitute identity that happens in the in-between, in the gathering of different peoples? There is a joy that creates. There is a joy that draws peoples together, rather than a joy that's built within segregated spaces. And I think this is one of the problems theologically in talking about joy, that we don't put it on the ground sufficiently to grasp the way in which joy is always embedded in the flows of community logics, the cultural logics of particular communities. And because of that, we probably have to press more deeply when we start to talk about the integrity of a Christian vision of joy, until we understand that dynamic.
So if you have a kind of cultural logic that sets patterns for expressions of joy, but it ends up being segregated joy? How do you break open out of the enclosure?
Yeah. This is where I wonder out loud if the life of Jesus, a kind of Christological intervention, is what's necessary for us to reconceive joy that opens us out rather than encloses. Now, I do want to take seriously the way in which a community finds joy and creates patterns of pleasure that are imagined to only exist in integrity when the outside others are kept out. We understand that. But here I'm wondering is if there is not a Christological intervention that the life of Jesus draws us toward that brings an invitation, that the very form of joy and pleasure and contentment and comfort that you imagine in the enclosed space can actually be something far richer, far more beautiful, far more pleasurable in this new space in which your joy is constituted with some of the very people who you imagine are a part of your despair, not a part of your joy. Or those who you imagine their joy is absolutely, and what they find enjoyable is absolutely foreign to what I would. And I do think there are some analogies. As I've said, I think there are artists, musicians, painters, and others who have shown that there's possibilities of living in, being sustained by a form of joy that is not homogeneous, that is fully captured inside, if you will, an expanding world of different people being brought together inside the sheer love of the music, for example.
So if I hear you rightly, there's something right and good about a kind of particularity of joy of an individual, particularity of joy of a family, particularity of joy of a cultural group. But there's also the goodness of the joy that transcends, that reaches out, that includes the other people. And music is one of the spaces where that can happen.
And to press even further, it could be that one theme underutilized by Christian intellectuals is precisely this latter reality that Jesus himself points us toward. A family that becomes reconfigured. So it's not the badness of, that family's vision of joy against the goodness of something else, but it is the opening up of that family's vision of joy.
So it's almost like a Pentecost joy.
Yeah.
Each speaking
Yes.
in their own tongue, but
Yes.
speaking that language of joy together.
Yes. And those who are doing the speaking, never imagining that this, in fact, would be the sign of the Spirit's coming.
Yeah.
This is not what they imagined.
They're slightly drunk in any case.
Right. They had dreams of power. They didn't have dreams of speaking others' language.
Yeah. You talked about certain geographies of joy, the spaces which are configured in particular way. Can you expound on that?
I think this is really important for us. As I like to say, Christians, we are geographically adrift. We don't think spatially as we should. And so what we have neglected is that joy is fundamentally tied to space. At one level, it is tied to real spaces and places. Segregated joy is most often sequestered joy, bounded joy territorially in particular places. So the cultural haunts and habitat of a people, this is where their joy is made known. And what we have to understand is it's precisely that kind of geographic dimension that we have to think about if, in fact, we want to think beyond segregated joy. We cannot simply say we ought to have a joy that we have together, but no one wants to think about, well, where are our bodies in space?
Right.
And how is space is configured.
So you need kind of public spaces.
You need public spaces.
And public rituals, possibly.
Public rituals bound to real space. And that's what's key. The kind of mapping of joy that would be necessary to actually start to think about the reconstituting of a different reality of joy. That's what's necessary. There's also the other ways in which space exists. As I said, I mean, there is the kinds of spaces constituted by practices of joy, like in music, as I call it, sonic space. There is that space. But fundamentally, that is built upon, and I never want to draw too sharp a distinction between other kinds of spaces and that geographic space. We really should start to attend to where do we find joy? Where do we find joy?
And in some ways, sort of, you've got this space for joy,
Yeah.
but you can constitute in it also a space of joy.
Yes.
Right? So
Yes.
somebody can walk into
Yes.
a space
Yes.
that have been marked by joy. What happens when somebody walks into a space marked by joy?
Well, you hope if the space is working, you hope for a kind of infection, and we know that. And my own experience in churches is that that's often what happens. There's a kind of infection of joy. You've come into a space that is not your own, and in some ways that space has claimed you as its own. And there's a very powerful analogy to, if you will, the work of the Spirit at that moment, that a space is created not by you, but in a strange sort of way, without you knowing it. It's for you. Now, obviously, we're talking beyond a kind of cultural tourism or kind of theological tourism. We're talking about people entering a space and in some very powerful way that we can't really chart out specifically. It takes hold of them. Maybe they didn't intend it, but it did. What would be great is if we start to think more intentionally about how such spaces are constituted and how might such spaces, the constitution of such spaces, be a fundamental part, for those of us who are Christian, our discipleship.
So you walk and you think, I need to walk into a space of joy. What would that space look like for you? What are spaces in which you yourself find joy?
Well, as I like to say, I'm a child of the church. And not every church I've been to is a space of joy.
Not my dad's church.
Let me be clear about that. But all in all, the church and multiple churches have been places of extreme joy, surprising joy. And to quote the title of a famous book by C.S. Lewis, places where I have been absolutely surprised by joy, stunned by joy. But, the reality of it is that I have been in spaces of joy in hospital rooms, gathered with a family and a loved one who's passing on, but there are rituals of remembrance going on, a grief process is being begun, and in the midst of that, incredible joy connected to sorrow. As you can probably tell now, I don't spend much time in barbershops anymore, but back in the day when I used to spend time in barbershops, barbershops and beauty shops are really interesting, especially in Black communities, because they can be in ways that are, as I like to say, profound realities of indirection. They can be spaces of incredible joy. Stories are told, jokes are told, people walk in, comments are made, and without you being spoken to directly, you've been spoken to. And at the end of the day, once you got your hair cut, you leave thinking, yeah, things are going to be better.
Thank you very much, Professor Jennings.
My pleasure.
Things are going to be better.
Absolutely, doctor.